Hello, friends! Today we'll draw a rose in a glass. We'll be using a loose technique and I'll show you a few effects. You might find these techniques interesting and use them to create your own compositions. Loose techniques often require a bit of practice, so try a few times on some old or unsuccessful sketches to train your skills. Don't get discouraged if it doesn't come easily right away. I have a rough draft myself right here. So let's start with our rose. We have a glass with a somewhat unusual shape, but we won't aim to render the glass in perfect detail. The main thing is to understand and convey the key elements. Form, the shape of the glass. Light, a highlight on the glass that follows its form. Water, inside the glass, represented by a thin white strip. Glass bottom, a thick, slightly oval bottom that reflects light. The rose will extend through the glass. We'll start by marking the bud's position. It's a small bud, likely a variety with smaller roses. The stem has a characteristic zigzag shape, with leaves sprouting from each bend. When drawing the leaves, remember not all face us the same way. Don't draw each leaf in the same orientation. Some branches will have large leaves, others with smaller leaves or even buds at the ends. The rosebud itself has a specific shape, like a small pitcher formed by two petals, one covering the other. This bud sits within other broader petals that embrace it. There are also leaves that grow from beneath the rose. Now let's move on to colour. If you're unsure about the colours, or even if you are, I recommend testing out colour combinations that will best match your vision. For the background, I'll mix a blue with a bit of reddish brown. I'll choose a classic blue and add an Indian red to create a warm, brownish purple tone. It doesn't have to be exact. Experiment to achieve a warm but subdued background. Now I don't want it too purple. I'll add a bit more colour here. I don't like this shade. It came out a bit dirty and grey, while I wanted a warm tone. Let's try a darker, richer blue instead. Even so, it's still not quite right. I might go for a lighter blue. In my rough sketches, I used ultramarine, but I wasn't entirely satisfied with it. Let me try another brown as well, maybe paired with classic ultramarine. I'll likely add a touch of red to make the shade more purple. Here I'm mixing ultramarine, cadmium carmine, and sienna, though the sienna isn't critical. It's just there to mute the brightness of the colours. You could use a similar shade. This'll be my background colour. Now I'll wet everything except the glass and rose itself, covering all the leaves as well to simplify things. I don't mind if the brush leaves a few streaks here and there. I'm not aiming for a perfectly clean white background. A slightly greyish tone is fine. Ultramarine is a colour you might be familiar with. It has granulation, which creates a unique effect. Some people find it unusual or even unsettling, but I think it's interesting, especially for shadows or surfaces where a bit of texture is okay. That said, shadows can be smooth too, depending on your idea. Here I used ultramarine with Indian red. Both are intense, highly pigmented colours, but since Indian red is opaque, it didn't blend evenly in the background. This wasn't due to granulation, but rather because it laid down in streaks, likely because I applied it too hastily.
Say what you wanna say to me now. I wanna wake up with you in the morning. Show me there's nothing fake to me now. I wanna wake up with you in the morning. Say what you wanna say to me now. I wanna wake up with
With the paper still wet, let's proceed. I'll start by creating an oval in the centre of the paper, not around the rose but directly in the middle. I'll paint this oval as if illuminated by a spotlight, highlighting the rose with a bright, focused light. Around this oval, I'll use a darker tone to make the rose appear as though it's glowing against the dark background. I aim to blend this transition smoothly, without visible lines. I hope I've managed to avoid those streaks that bothered me with Indian red, as it might have dried too quickly before blending fully. Now that I have a more even background, I'm pleased with the colour. I'll blot any excess water to prevent pooling. Next, I'll add the rose's shadow, slanted to follow the stem's angles. This shadow will match the background in colour, but be slightly darker and richer. Don't worry if the shadow overlaps the rose. It should look like a ghostly reflection of the rose. I like how ultramarine spreads here, separating slightly from the pink and forming a ghost rose effect. At this stage, let's avoid rushing, especially depending on how fast your paper dries. I'll add some background colour to the glass, as it's transparent and should reflect the background's greyish tone. We'll skip the highlight and leave some white parts along the glass's edges. You can make the water section slightly more bluish, so I'll add a bit of blue to the same mix. Here, the water's darkest part will be on the sides, and the lightest will be in the centre. I'm not trying to detail it precisely, but I'll blend in a bit more brown to the purple mix to achieve a slightly greyer shade. A touch of brown is enough, not too dark. For the glass, while it's still wet, I'll add some details inside. To do this, I've mixed a little more pink into the brown mix, using carmine because the branch inside the glass appears lighter than it would outside. I want to show this softness and where the branch bends as it enters the water. The line where it enters and exits the water should be subtly blurred, so I'm adding that effect now while the paper is still wet.
You and me got a whole other meaning, I don't know how. You and me just know how it feels when we're falling in love. Say what you wanna say to me now. I wanna wake up.
Next, I'll mix a green tone. I'll need several shades, some warmer and some cooler. For warmer greens, I mix blue with a bit of orange or yellow, but for cooler greens, I like combining ultramarine with ochre and yellow. Choose your own blends based on what you have and experiment. While the surface is still wet, I'm not painting exact details, I'm just hinting at the leaves here and there. It's essential not to be too rigid in this technique. Try to understand the logic behind it and don't just replicate my strokes. Loose techniques aren't always intuitive at first. By thinking independently, you'll learn to gauge where things should be denser or lighter, where to add shadows or highlights, and how to adjust colours. It's not just about the number of elements, but their colours and placement. I recommend moving step by step and focusing on the essence of your painting. Maybe do a few rough drafts to build confidence. Here, I'm filling in some branches in what may seem like a chaotic pattern, but there's a method to it. I'm thinking in terms of dense and sparse areas, following a natural flow. I'll let the background dry for now. If it doesn't dry quickly, I'll wait before continuing. If needed, I can also return to refine the background once it's set. Stepping back, I can already see an abstract composition emerging, even without focusing solely on the rose itself. The colours support each other here. Some are lighter, some darker, with warm and cool tones. It already looks interesting, just with a few strokes added to the rose. We'll add a bit more detail later, but not so much that it becomes overwhelming. Thank you, friends, for watching this video. This video is part of my paid tutorials. You can access other lessons through Patreon, directly on my website. I appreciate your support and would be grateful for any donations. Even if you aren't ready to watch the paid lessons but still enjoy my content and want to support the channel, you can find all the support options in the description below. Thank you so much. Don't forget to like, share with friends, and continue watching the tutorial. We won't go into too much detail to maintain that sense of spontaneity. Right now, I'm thoroughly cleaning my brush. I might start working with a dark colour, perhaps the same one I used for shadows, something greyish, and carefully add shadows without overdoing it. I want this to remain light and glowing against the background, a subtle greyish effect inspired by other artists' works on white roses that I've admired. The colour may not always match exactly with a reference photo, but I allow myself to adjust the tones to suit my vision of beauty. If you're working with a small sheet, use a small brush to avoid overdoing the colour on the rose. One more colour I'm adding is lemon yellow, a diluted shade to keep it clean and free of grey. I want it to be clear and visible in some spots. Meanwhile, the background is drying slightly but hasn't fully set. I'll pause the video here to let it dry a bit more. Once it's ready, I'll add some details to the rose. I'll try adding a bit to the stem while the surface is still wet. If your paint spreads too much, you can skip this step to avoid making it too intense. Again, I encourage experimenting because the behaviour of the paint can depend on the type of paper you use. For me, on this particular paper, the paint spreads differently. Where I place a blot, it spreads in a certain way. I might add more later or leave it as is. I'll decide as I go. The stem is quite dark, but I recommend keeping it subtle so it doesn't overpower the delicacy of the rose. Let's wait a bit for the paper to dry before moving forward. Once the background has dried, you'll notice it becomes paler. Now I'll add some small details and accents, especially in the middle of the rose. I'll add warmer and lighter tones where needed. There might be some shadows, but they're less intense here. Don't feel the need to replicate every single leaf. Focus on your work's overall balance. I'm adding more detail near the rose itself to make it stand out clearly, but I'm also ensuring it blends naturally into the composition. Take breaks often to step back and assess your work. I often have to tell myself, that's enough, because it's tempting, especially if you're inclined to detail, to keep refining every little part. But it's unnecessary to draw every single leaf. I'm confident you'll appreciate this style and see its beauty, just as I do. If you agree, keep trying, stop at the right moment, and don't be discouraged if it doesn't work out on your first try. This rose here is my 4th attempt. The first 3 tries were, well, the first attempt was just a trial, and the next 2 had something that didn't quite satisfy me. And keep in mind that even with the experience I've gained, there have been countless other attempts. I really liked a phrase from a book I read, which goes something like, "We don't learn much from our successful works. We learn far more from the ones that didn't work out." That's because these give us the opportunity to understand what went wrong and to experiment and try again. If everything goes smoothly, that's great, but I believe it's essential to try new things. That's what I wish for you, to experiment, explore and find your own style. Continue creating beautiful works, and I'll see you in the next workshops. Goodbye for now.